So thank you all for coming out in this very blizzardy, horrible weather. I'm glad we got such a turnout. So tonight we're going to give a general presentation of the draft phase 1 of the proposed zoning code. I'm Heather Shank, I'm the city planner, and I've been working on this with Lee for a while now. We did our kickoff meeting, some of you may have been there, in 2017, February?
About 2 years ago.
Yeah, it was also a blizzard at that time, so 2 for 2. So this is Lee Einsweiler. He is our planning consultant from Austin, Texas, with the firm Code Studio, and he's going to give a short presentation on some of the overarching aspects of the code, and then he's going to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
So I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. I apologize. All my cool winter clothes disappeared with my luggage over the Christmas holiday, and I've never been found, unfortunately. So I'm wearing my Texas shoes and hoping the snow doesn't get any deeper than the side of my loafers. Raining is okay, I can handle that. We'll pretend to be ducks. So what are we trying to achieve with the new zoning? That's kind of the fundamental question. Zoning exists, originally for 2 reasons. The first reason was the separation of uses. We didn't want to live next to the tannery or the heavy industrial plant, right? So there was use controls. And then we were worried about light and air, especially in New York City, in terms of the tenements. We used tools to manage the ability to get light and air into buildings. So we were managing the bulk and form of buildings. So those are our fundamental controls still today. And here we're going to be talking about how to apply them very specifically in a way authorized by the statutes here in the state, but as a way to implement your plans and your thinking. So number 1, I think on everybody's list is you have a fabulous community here in both Concord and Penacook and all the other little villages that are here within the city. And a lot of this is about preserving existing character. So as you grow, as you continue to thrive, how do we preserve some of that existing character? So that's one of the fundamental questions. How do we increase the housing opportunities across the entire community? Now, for you here in Penacook, that might mean something very different than it does necessarily down in Concord. But no matter what, we've heard from a lot of people, my kids can't come back here, they can't afford to be here, there's no place for the students to live, there's no place that's filled with millennials. We've heard a lot of comments about that. There are also comments at the other end of the spectrum, the boomer move down opportunities that some of the builders are starting to build for don't really exist here. When I move out of my large single family house, where is my townhouse or other low maintenance place? Where is my no-step residence so that I can, roll in a wheelchair? All of those kinds of things that we may be asked to accommodate at some point. So increasing housing opportunity is an intent of this code. It's also everybody's intent to streamline the development code. One thing that's true here is that the planning board operates with its own standards and it has its own rules. So here's the zoning rules and here's the planning board's rules for how you develop sites. Those have been kind of commingled over the years. There have been some portions of them in zoning, some parts of them were in the other book, and it wasn't really clear whether all those rules applied to you or not. So we're trying to draw a brighter line between those two and say, at minimum, here's your zoning, you start here. After your zoning and your allocation of rights, then you can move on to the design of your site, and those are in the site plan standards for larger developments. So streamlining the development code means a couple of things. It means trying to bring lots that were platted and laid out before zoning ever existed here into conformance with a code. So that is a really challenging kind of thing. If you have a 1960s era subdivision and it has platted lots that are all exactly the same and there's 6 blocks of them in the subdivision, it's really easy to zone for that place. But if you take a place that's just outside downtown Concord or that's just outside of the downtown area here in Penacook, The lots are a variety of sizes. There's big houses, there's little houses, there's a little of everything commingled. So finding a tool for that that doesn't create everything the same, which is what most of our zoning tools have been set up to do since the 60s and 70s. If we want to have that character that we've got, and we want to enhance that by gently infilling it and providing additional density, if we want to be able to do that, then we've got to bring those lots into conformance, or you'll spend all of your time in front of the zoning board saying, you know, I have to vary this, I have to vary that, I have to change this rule, I have to change that rule. We don't want to live in a world where all the rules have to be broken just to do what we consider normal development on your lot. So that's a lot of what we're looking at in the residential districts. There are also some questions about the ability to have a conversation about design of a project instead of a conversation about relief. Every time you go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, you're talking about relief, meaning if I say yes, you don't have to do something. Whereas when you're in a design conversation, now you're saying, well, maybe you aren't doing it that way, but how about you achieve the same thing, the same intent, by doing it in an alternative way? And you can actually ask them to uphold the intent of your standards through that design process. It's a much better place to be when trying to improve the quality of a project. So there is some of that in here. We have also gone so far as to simplify both the use table and the parking table, and you'll see those in a minute. The zoning map update includes a few new tools. So there is the new conservation district. When I first came and looked at your zoning map, I thought this place was lost. I thought we had all these acres and acres of land that we were just going to spread out and build on all over the place. And then somebody said, well, have you seen our conservation map? I'm like, no, I haven't seen your conservation map. And I saw that, and half of the land or more out there is already in conservation. It's already preserved in perpetuity. It's awesome. So you're doing a great job towards preserving the land that surrounds your growth boundary. So we made sure that that shows up on the zoning map now. So we have a color for conservation, and we apply rules to conservation now. We also, you had a piece for Penacook Lake that basically said, oh, this is RO district, but we're going to slap this overlay on, and we're going to double your lot area and then restrict what you can do to make sure you don't pollute the watershed and pollute our drinking water supply. So we've compressed those two together and just created a base district that does exactly the same thing. It's not totally a new thing, but again, shows up on the map of base districts, and you can now tell where that is. We, for the most part, have managed to eliminate split zoning, although as we found out today, there's still some lurking out there somewhere, and we'll have to keep looking for them. We're going to keep hearing about them, but split zoning is where a single parcel of land is chopped in two by another zoning district. Sometimes it's done intentionally, but most times it's just done accidentally because you have old maps and whatever else that came together in the GIS system and are now inaccurate now that we have more accurate lots. In addition, we are talking about a new approach to the allocation of rights in our residential districts, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it relies on the frontage of the lot, because the way that those lots feel as you move along the street is one of the most important elements. So, what does all of this new rules stuff look like? Well, we have residential districts that look like this. They regulate the district itself, they regulate the lot, the placement of the building on the lot, and all of that, those first three columns, are 2D kinds of ideas, right? They're flat ideas. And then they also regulate the building, the 3D development on the site. And there are some new tools in regulating the building that help us with those character questions, like the width of the building, for example, and the need to have windows facing the street. All of those are new ideas, and a door facing the street. What a crazy idea that might be, to actually have a door on the front of each of the houses facing the street. Mixed-use districts regulated the same way, the same fundamental model, the district itself, how the lot is managed, how the building is placed, and then finally the 3D version of it. Now, the important part in most of these districts is that we are changing the pattern of development from what is sometimes there or sometimes mixed today. And most of the districts have what we call a build to. So today, in a residential district, for example, you would typically have a setback. It would say you can come no closer than 10 feet from the street, but you can be back as far as you want on your lot. Those are choices for you as the homeowner. In commercial areas, we don't typically allow that same level of flexibility, because what happens then is you'll have a lovely building up along the street, and I'll walk to the next site and there's a huge parking lot in front of the building. And then maybe there's another one that's up to the street, and then there's another parking lot. That's not an interesting place to be. That's not a good way to develop the kinds of Main Street activity that you have in downtown Concord and that you may have in other places over time. And some of that exists here in downtown Penacook. That green area on the placement diagram is setting a minimum and a maximum. You can be this close and you can't be any farther back than that. And it's a pretty narrow range. We also ask you to be a certain width in that area as well, because as I'm walking down the street past that building, again, I can't have just the skinny little end of the building and then a huge parking lot. That's not a walkable environment. It's not engaging to the usual people on the street. But turn that building the other way and bring them along the street, and now I've got something to look at. It's interesting. There's windows, there's doors, there's activity inside the building. So some different tools perhaps than you'd been using before. The use table is also compressed. We got you down to a page and a half, fundamentally, from pages and pages of use table before. The colors on the tops of these columns match the colors on the zoning, so that at a certain point you'll get kind of used to looking at the zoning map and the use table together. Those colors actually also show up in the thin lines of the districts as well, so you can make that linkage directly between the pages you're supposed to be looking at and the color you're seeing on the map. If you happen to be colorblind, that's fine. We've got the text on there as well, so you can see what all of it is. In addition, one of the hardest things to deal with in a community is when one intensity or use is changing to another one, when those things abut. And when they abut, we would normally call that a transition. Something's changing from something to something else. So especially when I'm at the back edge of commercial, and I'm reaching and the next piece is residential, whether it's single family or two family or whatever, that causes a little friction right along there, right? If you're putting your dumpster back on my lot line and it smells in the summer, all kinds of things that can go on that create problems along there. So we're firm believers in the notion of a transition buffer along a district boundary between residential uses and non-residential uses. What we've set up so far is a very simple system. If you're a short building under 20 feet, you can have a small buffer because you're not as intense. You're not even perhaps even as tall as my house might be. But if you're a taller building, we need a 30-foot wide buffer, and we have a planting prescription and a fence or a wall in that buffer. So those ideas are a way to ameliorate the impact of things that are coming right up against you. Now, we also have transitions in the application of the districts in bands or, in general in circles around something, getting more intense towards a center. You have a center here in Penacook, there's a center in downtown Concord, and each of the districts, the height and intensity of use, etc., steps away from the center. So we have that land use transition as well, which is not a zoning tool, it's a zoning map tool. So that shows up really only in the way things are applied on the map. So you have to follow the map as well to understand how these intensities are increasing towards the center. Also wanted to show you that we've tried to clarify who does review of what, who makes decisions, who's going to look at the application, and so we have this authority table, and each of the procedures that you'll be going through are included in here. That table itself is the shorthand version. It really says it's reviewed by this person and there's a recommendation made, and then there's a hearing here, and if you need to appeal, you go there, right? It walks you through who you're going to be talking to in each of those processes and helps you see sort of, am I in the most intense process, which would be changing the zoning or doing a text amendment? All of those have to go all the way up to City Council. Am I looking at a site plan? And that's the kind of thing that's in front of the planning board. And the planning board in some areas is getting architectural design review done in support of that planning board action. Am I in the least intense? I have the smallest kinds of things. I'm doing an addition on my house, and that perhaps can stay at the staff level, right? So all of those approval processes, step by step, are included in here. Now, I want to say one important thing, and that is that small projects stay inside the zoning book because for the most part staff is reviewing them with zoning standards, mostly black and white. When we have discretionary conversations about, ooh, I kind of like this and I kind of don't like that, and that's not really meeting what we meant when we were talking about in our plan. When we have that kind of discussion, it's held before the planning board. They're the entity that does their job in public, right? Those conversations are held in a public meeting, in a public hearing setting. The discussion is all public and the decision is made in public. We're differentiating between the smaller kinds of things done at the staff level. The site plan review thresholds say whether you're going to go on to the planning board or not. Those site plan review thresholds will be forthcoming in the new version of the site plan standards, which will come out when hopefully when the next draft of this comes out. I want to point out to you that we have a project website. So I apologize if you went prowling around on the city's website looking for pieces of this. They exist on this website that our firm set up called ConcordNEXT.info. This does have the existing zoning ordinance and the existing map. It has the new zoning ordinance, the new map, has the times of all the public meetings, and tries to keep you informed as we go along. I want to point out that the book right now is all just black and white text. And there's nothing underlined, there's nothing redlined or struck out. You can't tell what came from the old book and what's new. Really, only the consultant team and Heather probably know those things. But what will happen from here on out, if you review this draft and there's something you love or something you hate, and you want to follow that as it goes forward, the next draft, when it comes, is going to have red line and strikeout. So you can see the comments that you made to us about it are going to show up as changes on the map. They may also show up as changes in the text, right? So we're going to try to follow along and help you understand what the changes are. Other things that you can do. So if you're not the kind of person that wants to talk in a public meeting, you can definitely reach out directly to Heather. You can certainly go grab a copy of the draft if you're dying to get in the weeds with the rest of us owners. You can provide written comments. Those are best if they go to Heather, but they can come in most any way you can get them to us. If you feel like sending them to a planning board member that you know or somebody else, they will get to the right place. And then eventually, as this is going through adoption, if you want to support ideas or you're against ideas, either one, the activity surrounding that takes place first in front of the planning board, who will make a recommendation, and then in front of the city council. So that will lead to the final adoption. If we're lucky, we'll get this adopted before the next budget. That's the hope of the council. And so that's what's driving us to have these meetings right now, is to try to be ready with a revised draft that can begin that planning board process and eventually get to council before they're done with the budget hearings and get all caught up in that. So that's what I have to share with you tonight, and we'll be around to answer some questions.
I would like to get a little more detail about what's the difference in the residential, because I don't think we talked
Sure.
about, you didn't talk about, I mean, I can do that if you want me to.
No.
Talk about the difference between the way we're allocating rights and...
So let's actually open the code instead of just the show. And let's look at that. So, yes,
So
You can start with that.
Summary table, and what it does is it tells you on the left-hand side are the standards for the existing districts in the code, and I kept it simple. I'm just looking at lot size, lot width, and setbacks. And on the right-hand side is what the new districts or the new code would be. And for the most part, a lot of that is really not changed in the residential districts. What is more changes in the mixed-use districts, because a lot of the standards in the mixed-use districts were not really designed to encourage small-scale, dense urban development. So they might have lot width requirements of like 200 feet or 150 linear feet, which is not conducive to a small-scale redevelopment or encouraging development at a small scale. So it's reducing and sort of making it easier for small-scale development to occur in those mixed-use districts. I'm just going to go ahead and pass here. I'm going to pass those, and I'll keep this one. And I think Lee's going to give a summary of what all of these things. For the most part, where you see spaces, it's because there wasn't necessarily a one-to-one correlation between the old and the new. There's also, in the existing, one thing that I did on the chart in the existing, if you look in the column where the sort of initials are, you'll see RO, RO, RM, RM, RM. They'll see multiple, you'll see districts listed multiple times. And the reason that's there is because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that under the existing code, there are lots of different scenarios under which your development standards, your dimensional standards will be different. And so you don't actually have one RM district, you have three. And so for the most part, we didn't really add districts, we just sort of simplified them so that instead of looking in one place for one district and then, oh wait, here's all of the different conditions that change that information, I just literally called out, if you're doing this, these are your standards. If you're doing that, those are your standards. And that really goes to show that our existing code is pretty complicated, because if you actually just look at the dimensional table in the book, it won't give you all of this information. It will tell you one thing, but then when you want to go to develop, you'll discover, oops, nope, there's all these different things that make that not true. So in the new code, everything just is straightforward. It is what it is. There's no, you have to look in this different section and find out that your dimensional standards are actually different. So with that, go ahead.
So I apologize that this is not necessarily clear enough for you to see the whole screen, but I'm just going to talk you through what some of the components are here and how they change. So this happens to be a sort of in-town single-family district. And the key to today's regulations are that you have lot area, and that's a minimum, and that's what really allocates your rights. And in the majority of the districts, they are single-family residential districts. Now, the state stepped in and said, in single-family residential districts, you should be allowing accessory dwelling units. And the city decided that in doing that, they would have to be in the main house. They can be an extension of the main house, but so we are currently allowing fundamentally 2 units per site today, right? The main house and a smaller accessory dwelling unit is allowed for the most part today. So here you're seeing a lot area and width that apply to the creation of new lots. An existing lot, if we applied these standards, lots and lots of existing lots would be non-conforming. But what we looked at instead was really the patterns of development. And the key thing that we could use, given all these mixed lot sizes, the key thing that we could use was the frontage of the lot. And so we are beginning to allocate the rights to the lot based on its width instead. And yes, some lots are very, very deep here. That says to me that you have hopes of doing a subdivision on that site and bringing a street in to service all that back land that you might have. But otherwise, if we're just looking at what you can do today, like when we were looking at the patterns earlier, we're really just talking about being able to create a certain pattern along the street. And so right now, we are generating the number of units allowed total maximum on your lot based on the width of your lot. So let's say you had the typical 50-foot lot width. This is 2 units, as it would be today, right? 20 feet apiece, you don't get 2.5 units, you get 2 units. And then livable area is an idea that the assessor uses to talk about your house and charge you for it, charge your taxes for it, which is to fundamentally say, you know, heated space with walls and all those kinds of things. That's the livable area. Your unheated garage, your attic space with no improvements, those are not part of your livable area, right? So the allocation, to make sure that the scale of houses is right, we gave you the units for it, but how big is it? How small is it? The allocation of livable area is here as well. And basically, the livable area is used as a surrogate for saying houses should be small on small lots and bigger on big lots.
Is this a residential?
That is a residential district.
Okay.
This is R5.
Can I
I think. Yes.
step back a little bit?
Yes.
So as Lee was saying, currently how the property rights or use is allocated, we have single-family districts, we have medium density, which has actually a lot of different expressions that can take. We've got RN, neighborhood residential, and then we've got RD, downtown residential, which are both multifamily districts. What we switched to was looking at the lot area. So when you see R40, that means 40,000 square feet lot. When you see R10, that means a 10,000 square foot lot. Those numbers now indicate directly how much lot area you need to subdivide. And so if you'll notice on the map, the boundaries of the districts are very similar. And that's because those areas are similar enough in terms of their lot area that we can do that. So we're not necessarily changing the district boundaries or how they function in that way, but we're just calling it more directly what it actually is. So the 7.5 district is the district that you would need 7,500 square feet to subdivide. So a lot of the changes that we made in terms of lot area for subdivision and lot frontage were based on creating the highest degree of conformity with those existing neighborhoods. Because when Lee did his analysis last year or a year and a half ago, he found that in some districts there were up to 60% nonconformity with regard to the lot area and the frontage, which meant if you wanted to go and do certain things on that lot, you wouldn't be able to. You might need to get variances depending on what it is that you wanted to do. Or if there's a change of use or anything like that, you might need to get variances. So we basically right-sized the zoning, which means we made the zoning more compatible with what the actual development in the neighborhood is. And how we chose those numbers is basically what is the average in that area. We chose the numbers that were low enough to create the most nonconformity while...
The most conformity.
What? The most high
The most
degree of
conformity.
without allowing excessive subdivisions. So if you go in a neighborhood, you pretty much can pick out those lots that are double lots, right? So those lots that are double lots, they might have like, according to the existing code, maybe like 10 or 15 feet, not enough really to subdivide. But you can see that compared with the rest of the development neighborhood, it's a double lot, right? So we changed that lot now would most likely be able to subdivide, and there would be able to be an infill house there. But we didn't set the number low enough that everyone would just be able to subdivide their lot. We're basically setting it so those oversized lots now would most likely be able to subdivide. So when you see R10, R7.5, R5, that's talking about how much lot area you would need to subdivide. There's also frontage requirements, so we changed the frontage requirements to be more consistent with what the average frontage is on the lot. So what Lee's describing here about, 1 per 20 feet, I think that says what you can
Yes.
see it.
Apologize.
We're now using frontage to allocate the amount of units you have on your lot. So there's not now there's not single family, duplex, multifamily districts. They're all the same. Okay, and depending on how much frontage you have is how many units you can do. And the reason we did that was to help people if they wanted to add extra unit in their house for a family member or for rental income. A lot of people have come to us wanting to do extra units, and they end up either having to get variances or not getting variances, and and not being able to do it, or they just stop trying because nobody wants to go to ZBA. The other thing is that if you wanted to do a detached unit in your back, you now are able to do that under this existing code. You can do a separate secondary structure on your lot. So the numbers that we chose were designed to allow basically the average person to do another unit in their house if they want, and or some type of detached structure in the back. That's what we considered as the baseline. This is, on most people that I've talked to, this has been a really popular concept because a lot of folks have tried to do this. I also want to point out that Penacook, most of Penacook, almost everything on the map that we saw earlier is actually zoned multifamily. And the reason that there isn't that much multifamily is because there are all these obstacles, I would call them obstacles, to actually producing multifamily development, which we've removed. So in the current code, you need 1.5 times the area, 1.5 times the lot frontage if you want to add an extra unit. We're now saying, nope, the base that you have is the base that you need, and if you want to add an extra unit and you have enough frontage to do so, you can do it. So there's not extra that you need to add another unit. The current code also requires like 25-foot landscape buffers anytime you want to do multifamily, which say you have a 3-unit structure or you have a 2-unit structure and it makes sense you want to add a 3rd unit. I'm sure you all can think of many places where it would be totally inappropriate to put a 25-foot buffer around one lot just for doing 3 or 4 units when it's basically the same house as the next door neighbor's house. So there are a number of things that we took out of there to make it easier for people to have more housing choices and to do more with their property that we want. We also reduced parking requirements for additional units. So currently you need 2 parking spaces for every unit. We changed that to say you need 2 parking spaces still for single family development. If you have a duplex, it's 1.5 spaces. And for everything after that, it's 1 additional space. So if you've got a 5-unit building, you're only going to need to provide 5 spaces instead of 10. So that allows people, they no longer have to provide these massive amounts of impervious surface that they may not need. If they want to provide more parking, they're able to, but we're not going to require them to provide, because in many cases when you have 3 or 4 or 5 units, you're not going to need 2 parking spaces. So these are some, I'm kind of going on here, but I just wanted to say.
No, that's really good.
Some of the changes that we're doing that are making it easier for people with residential options, because we know that we need housing in Concord. We know that we want to provide infill housing and not expand with single family development, and that we don't necessarily want to provide huge apartment complex. We want to provide it in a more efficient, kind of gentler way to provide more housing options. I will also say that in the mixed-use districts, currently there are floor-to-area ratios to regulate density. There are other density restrictions. Under the new code for these districts, as long as you meet your lot coverage, your setbacks, your height restrictions, you can put as many units in there as you like. So, which is significantly different from the current code. In most cases, so you have to comply with the building code, essentially. You can't not comply with the building code. But if you comply with all the applicable regulations, we haven't created some, say your maximum building height is 45 feet, and your lot's only 80 feet wide. There's really only so many units you're going to be able to fit in there. So we're not just limiting it based on some random density model. So what was the last thing that I wanted to point out?
I have a couple more if you want me to riff for a moment while you're. So one of the things that we're all worried about is the future character of these neighborhoods, right? So if you imagine what those neighborhoods look like today, most of them were built without garages, for example. So now if I take a classic suburban home, garage forward, kind of model of a ranch home, and I stick that on the in-town lot, I've got an unsuccessful neighbor for most of the lots. So on larger lots, those patterns are possible, but on the smaller lots, we're not allowing parking in that primary street yard. So the space between the face of your building and the street is not appropriate for parking. So if you just take the side lot lines and you bring them out to the street, it's a no-no to use that for required parking. You can't get credit for required parking. So you also have a side and rear setback, and you have a driveway width. So when that driveway is crossing the sidewalk, it's only 12 feet wide. Once you're on your property, you get to widen it back out again. But we want the walkability that comes with fundamentally a one-lane driveway leading up to your house. So at the garage, you can have a 2-car garage that's, set partially back and have that wider apron as long as you're meeting your lot coverage and all of those things. But it's going to end up set back further. It's going to be accessed from a narrow driveway, not a wide suburban driveway, but an urban driveway. So that's one more element. In addition to that, we brought forward your accessory structure rules, which allow a small structure under 250 square feet, think shed, right? Allow that up to 12 feet tall within the setback to a much smaller setback, so that is something that can be more flexible in being located in your backyard. We have the building heights. Many of them are at 2.5 stories, right? So this is constraining you. If you want sort of the maximum thing, you're doing a 1/2 story to get to that top piece. And otherwise, fundamentally, these are 2-story homes. There is the width of the building, a maximum for that, so that they fit in and are in character with the buildings on the site. There is a certain amount of windows on both the ground story and the upper stories. There is a street-facing entrance, and one of those entrances, maybe you have a street-facing entrance on both the front and the side if you're on a corner lot, but one of those entrances has to have a porch or a raised entry associated with it, a sort of feature that is on many of the existing houses. So there are a wide variety of sort of character protection tools in here. We don't go to the nth degree. We don't say you need spindles on your porch and some of those other kinds of things. There's a lot of flexibility in how an architect might design a house that meets these standards. But the fundamental elements of the form and the placement and fitting in scale and intensity with what's around it will be correct. In addition, one of the pieces you don't see because it's off in the procedural pieces, if you do a secondary building on the site and we get up to 3 units, we think we might be able to do architectural design review for that building, so that we can actually have a conversation about those larger buildings that might occur on the site. If you're just splitting up the main house, we don't have that authority, but otherwise we might be able to get it. So we're working on that piece as well.
I just wanted to also point out another thing that's new in terms of architectural features is the requirement for a certain percentage of windows on the front of the building or a side that's facing the street. And that's to prevent a few things. It's to prevent people from maybe shifting their building so that it's, the side is facing the street and then you don't have that.
If it's the kitchen and the movie room, right, and there's no windows at all, and we're looking at that from the street, it's kind of an unhappy outcome.
So it
doesn't feel friendly.
20%
Yes.
of the facade that faces the street would have to have windows or doors or some opening or something like that. And that's to sort of maintain that character of residential character and appealability on the street. I wanted to jump a little bit to the use table. So another thing that's different about the use tables, if any of you have ever looked at our use tables, they're like 30 pages long, and that's because they list every single thing under the sun in the use table. How we got it down to, it's actually 2.5 pages.
Sorry, that's right.
The primary
Dang.
uses, 1 page for the accessory uses. And how we got it down like that is because we collapsed a lot of things into more general categories. So there may be a use such as medical. So if you are anything having, medical will be defined. If there's anything relating to a medical use, it's just going to say medical, and it's going to allow you by right in certain districts. We're not listing every medical use that we can think of. The challenge is that somebody comes in, oh, that's not in our use table, you immediately have to go to get a variance.
Yeah.
In this scenario, if it's not listed, the zoning administrator determines, well, it's medical, so that's where it's allowed.
So here's that row for medical, right, with a wide range of permissions. But if you're an alternative treatment center, wow, what a non-cultivation location, that should kind of give you a hint about what we're talking about there, right? That's a much more restricted kind of a use. And the hospital, which doesn't belong in every location, right? Hospital is also a much more constrained use. Those are medical. We can both agree that they're medical, but they are different. And so the rules for everybody else and the rules for except are here. The table may expand a little as we go through this review process. We did discover a use we needed to add today, which was call centers. We may have to go in and regulate call centers because they're quite different from other kinds of offices, for example. But fundamentally, we've been able to collapse that. Those categories then, just so you don't think that those are somehow, wild kinds of things. Oops, there's medical right there. So each category is defined, each of the uses within it get defined, so that we actually have some backup for what we're saying. And so when the code administrator is making decisions, the zoning administrator is making decisions about a use that's coming in, they do have some backup beyond just the row on the table.
We actually don't have general medical defined, so you may want to add that in.
Yes, we do need to do that.
Just the alternative.
No, you're right. You're right.
That might be in the glossary in the back, but you should probably have general medical
I hear you. There's always a note to take.
in front of everybody.
That's good. That's good.
The parking table, we did something similar. We kind of collapsed things into similar categories. The parking table may need a little more attention on some categories that I just got today. My great thick manual of transportation manual of parking parking.
ITE.
Yes, ITE.
So you remember that's suburban. That's
So that
all
I
I'll
can
say.
look up all of our parking and compare them to what the current standards are and make sure that they're up to date.
So these follow the same order as the use table. So as you begin, or certainly as the administrators begin to get used to the use table, they're in the same place. They might be called out here separately in a way that they're not on the use table, depending on whether they have the same impact. One of the key things, though, about modernizing parking regulations, a couple of things. You need to pick out the real egregious ones and make sure they have an adequate standard. So as an example, somebody mentioned the event center down in Bedford. And did we have something that handled event centers because it was underparked when it was approved and now it's going bankrupt because not enough people can park there to pay for the events, to whatever. And the state said you can't use our road to valet your cars. So there's a whole mess in Bedford associated with an event center. So we were asked to look at event centers. So it'll probably show up on the table here somewhere. Yes.
There's two more things I wanted to say. One about parking is, oh my goodness, it just completely escaped me. I shouldn't have interrupted you.
That's okay. So
So a few changes that we made to parking. Currently, you have to meet your parking requirement on site. In the new code, we're allowing a few things. We're allowing you to park off-site, not on the street. Street parking doesn't count. But if you can park at another location and have some type of documentation that you have permission to do that for a sufficient amount of time, you can meet your parking requirement at off-site within, I don't know, some 1,000 linear feet.
Quarter mile.
Like that, which is kind of huge because that allows a more efficient allocation of parking spaces and to some degree could potentially create a market for parking. We, however, do not allow surface parking lots in residential districts, so it's not the case that someone could just demolish their house and start a business selling parking spaces. But we're allowing parking on off-site to help meet parking requirements. We also added the option for conditional use permits for a number of things that don't exist currently. And the reason for that is so that for small things or for things that we think might change and we don't want people to have to go to the zoning board for, you can get a conditional use permit and go to the planning board. So one of those conditional use permits is for the number of parking spaces. Currently, if you're required to have 27 spaces, but you can only provide 25, and actually you only really need 20, you would have to go to the ZBA to get a relief off of those 2 spaces. So we're offering you the ability to get a conditional use permit if you have some type of parking study to demonstrate that you don't really need those spaces. You can go to the planning board and get approval without going to the zoning board to have relief for the parking spaces. So we did that for a number of things with the thinking that a lot of projects are going to come to planning board anyway. So let's give the option for conditional use permits for some of these things so that you don't have to go first to the zoning board and then to the planning board, which costs a lot more time and a lot more money to have to go through both things. So that's another of the things that we're doing to try to streamline the development process and make it cheaper and easier for people to get here.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. those were my.
I think that's good. The only other thing I was going to say about parking is you'll see many uses have the same standard now. And the focus on that, if you stop and think about Penacook, if you've got something in a storefront now and it goes out of business and you want to put something new in, if the parking standard changes, then in theory, you've got to produce some more parking somewhere. So by putting a fair number of uses, a lot of retail uses, office and other kinds of things on parity, you can swap in and out those uses and not be subject to that challenge. Not that you couldn't get relief in other ways if you had to produce additional parking, whether off-site or whatever else. But fundamentally, trying to make sure that people don't get caught up in not being able to tenant their spaces for want of a parking space. It's not the way the world is headed. So, yeah, I'm open to questions if you guys have some. Yes, go ahead.
Well, the whole thing with parking, it doesn't seem like there's fewer cars coming into the world, so parking is really critical that they don't just wind up bleeding into every street. And we look like, Newton and all these towns in Boston where everybody's parking on top of each other. So that would be my concern.
Yeah, certainly. And I would wish for downtown Penacook the problem of needing a structured parking deck to serve your parking needs. You're not there right this minute, right? Free parking is available, throughout the area. So there will come a time, however, when you're successful enough that you're going to begin charging for parking. And that would likely start, right on Main Street, right in the key areas, and, stretch out from there, whichever direction, perhaps towards that opportunity corridor site, heaven knows. But there is a future for you somewhere in which parking demand will be higher than necessarily the land available to accommodate it. And at a certain point, you'll need some opportunity for structured parking. If you can get that in a shared way, that's the best possible answer. It's the most efficient. We're finding out now that we have this new technology, if you've driven into a brand new parking garage lately, right? It tells you as you're driving in how many spaces are available. You drive through, it tells you how many on this floor. You see the little green lights above the ones that are open, and there's red lights on the ones that have cars in them. We're getting to the point where we really know what's going on in parking garages, and they're way emptier than we thought. They're far lower utilization than we thought. So we've got to be more efficient with that so that we can get to the point where we can afford to pay for parking. So, question?
So, what I've seen is on a 5,000 square foot lot and up to a certain point, having a door on the front and windows in the front makes sense. But if you get up to a big enough lot where your house is sitting way back from the street, trees and bushes in front of it, it doesn't make and your driveway goes next to the house, it doesn't make sense that you'd have to have the door and windows on the front.
Yeah, so I'll address that. So that is the case for some of the denser neighborhoods. So I don't think that requirement applies in the R40 or the RO district.
Right this minute, it's only not applied on the 2-acre lot.
Which is
ROS. But it could. We have proposed to vary some standards down to the 1-acre lot level. And I don't disagree with you. We could probably let go of that standard. I still love the notion that houses face a street and that they look like they face a street. And
I was thinking like a 2-acre lot.
Okay.
If you're back that far.
Yeah,
So when you have a big lot and you might have a windy whatever, it wouldn't apply in those districts.
That's good to hear.
R40,
Yeah.
which is an acre lot,
Yeah.
you could have that same.
Right.
yeah, so we could consider that. So right now you'll see here it just says not applicable. So this happens to be the 2-acre lot. We could include the 1-acre lot in that as well.
Because you may not even really see the house. From
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. Good point.
Have any
Thank you.
small cities around here adopted similar?
No.
So this is what we call a form-based code. So there are other cities that have form-based code, sections of their code. More and more are doing it. Concord would be the first to have a fully comprehensive form-based code. So we're pretty excited about it, but different elements of this code exist in other communities. They're doing Dover, Keene, Portsmouth. I'm not sure where. I know there are other.
So citywide or just district by district?
They've done. I'm not sure of the extent. I know
Mostly in the downtown.
Yeah, I think mostly multiple districts, but really the only difference I think is for Concord is we're basically using a framework for a form-based code, and we've got the graphics, the graphic component, and the rules for all standards that are like derived from there. But if you look on your actual the sheet here, you'll notice, because it's pretty much one like line item. Like if you look at, for instance, the institutional district, there's no change.
Right.
So the form of it may be different for some of these other districts, but there's really no change in what you can do and how it works. So there's a big pieces of this code are just taken right over from our current code. And we're right now just focusing on those pieces that are different.
But
No, I'm just trying to think if there's someplace you could go and
More and more
yeah,
people,
so
look
that,
at it.
more and more
you know,
people will
see
be
how
doing
looked
it.
and-
so I think that the challenge of the allocation of rights is one that lots and lots of places face that are old enough to have come before zoning, right? New York City, 1916, the rest of us, after that. If your patterns were fundamentally established, by that period, I'm not certain when the first zoning code was adopted here, but
If you want to look,
1934.
the first zoning? No, there wasn't any zoning back then. So
wait,
that
no, in Concord you're talking about. And where? What did you say?
1834? 1934, I could agree.
Yeah, that's what he said. He said 1940.
1934.
But I'll tell you that
I'll go with that.
Dover has had a form-based code district for a very long time. I'm not sure if they developed new since then, but Portsmouth has like 3, I think, that are existing, and you can go look and find them.
But mostly in the
none of-
downtown areas.
Yeah.
okay.
But I don't know if they have documents that are quite so comprehensive as the one that we have.
The largest citywide.
A lot of planning conferences bragging.
Largest citywide one is the city of Miami, but many people call the city of Denver a form-based code as well. So there's a couple of them there if you want to look at the bigger ones. Other smaller ones, for example, ones that we've done, Asheville, North Carolina, we've done 2 there in 2 very different pieces, not in the downtown, in the River Arts District and along one of their corridors leading out of town. In Fort Worth in the stockyards, in Fort Worth also adjacent to TCU University to help them manage the student population. So these exist in lots and lots of places. I have a little tough time with hey, it's a form-based code and it's going to be perfect. It's zoning, its authority comes from the RSA authority for zoning. It's fundamentally zoning. We call it a form-based code because we focus a lot more on the form, and we're downplaying a little bit what we talk about in regard to the uses. So it's kind of playing up character a little more than use. Use used to be the whole and the be-all and end-all of our codes, houses over here, industry over there. And we've gotten over that mostly. Now a lot more focus on form. But fundamentally, it's a zoning ordinance.
Just curious.
Yes, sir.
20% window up front. Can you
Yes.
take into consideration of building code nowadays, 8% of a room to have glazing? How do you?
So the principal building code requirement that gets impacted here is ingress egress, the fire code. 20% is a minimum glass that we're looking for, but we're only looking for it on the street facing side. So if you're concerned that you're going to blow out your energy budget for the building, you can make up for that on the sides or rear of the building. So the 20% is actually a fairly reasonable standard.
Not that bad.
No. It's
Each room right now requires.
we could go measure a bunch of existing houses and we'd find that they're at that standard already.
New Hampshire requires accessory dwelling units now, right?
Yes.
This form form-based code is gonna take over big time anyway, because New Hampshire's implemented that law, that you cannot stop a single resident putting an in-law apartment in your place. So is the assessor's office gonna challenge it differently? Like, how's the tax base gonna go on that, which we should be concerned about? And after they leave, so it gives more affordability to the person who's living in that house.
The only thing the assessor cares about is comparable,
Right, but I'm saying.
right? So if you got to find another house with a unit that's sold, and then,
I'm talking about if you have two kitchens, it's the same as one kitchen, it's taxed different, correct?
yes, so,
Additional units. So if you have 2
Right,
units.
so I mean,
you're
it's gonna help the average person to maintain their home longer
yes.
and develop. So this new base system is starting to take off more and just, all over the place.
Imagine you can pay, you know, half or more of your mortgage plus your taxes based on that revenue stream. All of a sudden, you've got money to maintain your house that you never had before,
I think
right?
it's great.
So yes, there's a real opportunity there. Yes, sir.
These building standards that you're
Yes.
talking about, or I'll just say aesthetic, like a porch and a door.
Design, we like to say, but
So would that make every house look basically the same? Like-
no.
Okay.
No.
That's the charm of New England, is everyone's modified their house over 100 years.
Of course.
And they don't all look the same.
Of course. So, you know, if I tell you everybody has a porch, you could walk up and down your street and see 10 different porches. Now, if I'm building 20 houses in a new subdivision, would there be a tendency for the porches to kind of look the same? Maybe. Certainly developers have done that before. But I think in these sort of gentle infill, a lot at a time, et cetera, I don't think you're going to see that problem of everybody designing the same porch. The standards for the
Allows, subtlety.
a lot of flexibility in regard to how you achieve that porch, yes. Other questions?
Thanks for coming in.
I just have one more. So in residential areas, you are not saying that let's say you're on the street with some commercial stuff, that house would have to be close to the street if it's on a smaller lot, you know, where the parking has to be in the back?
So the residential homes have a permissive setback. So if you had a deep lot and you chose to move your lot further back, you're going to have a longer driveway and whatever else. But if you choose to move farther back on your own lot, that's a matter of choice for you. But between your building and the street, we're not going to want your parking area out there. So your parking is still supposed to be beside the house or behind the house, right? As long as you manage that and sort of manage the character challenge of cars in the front yard, then you're allowed to be permissively further back behind.
And that's even in more rural districts too?
So the rural districts operate a little bit differently, and especially at a certain point, you are required to do cluster development. So 4 or more units being developed in the R40, ROS, and RWS, our 1 acre, 2 acre, and 4 acre district. In those 3 districts, if you go over 4 units, or if you build a new street, either one of those, you're going to trigger a requirement to follow the cluster standards. So the cluster standards, I mean, it's a pretty simple idea. You bring the houses closer together.
And you want to have your parking in front of your house?
So let's make sure here that I don't misspeak, but the setback for the parking is 20 feet in the 4 acre parcel. So it's a little bit away from the road, but you
No big
have plenty of land on the 4 acre parcel. Although presumptively, part of the reason you're a 4 acre parcel is a big portion of your parcel is unbuildable. Right? These aren't flat farmland that we're just ready to build 4 acre homes on. It is, yeah, but I guess the main point is where we require 4 acres is an area in which your site's usually constrained. So, well, sure you can.
The porch requirement.
Yes.
Is that for any new homes that are being
Yes.
built? So like, I mean, back in the 80s, they're all like colonials or Mines of Gambrell. Ranches. They're going to require a porch on the front of those houses now?
No.
No.
Any existing house is fine.
No.
But if
Built new one, yeah.
you tear down your ranch house and you build new, Well, first off, I pretty much guarantee the house that's new is going to be 2 stories, right? It's not going to be 1 story like your ranch might be, right? So already they're kind of changing the form and the character. And so, yes, we're going to ask them, generate something there. If you look at your ranch house, you may actually have an entrance feature already. You may, even in the front of a ranch, there might be, you know, a little bit of a roof, you know, that goes out over the entryway. It is just a feature that kind of shouts to the world, here's where you go in, right? And those exist on almost every kind of house. Not on the ultra-contemporary homes, admittedly, but there will be, I'm sure somebody will try in a very contemporary way to create, you know, a porch model that goes with a very, you know, sort of modern contemporary form at some point. So yes, these are not rules that say there's a ranch house next to you on both sides, build like the ranch house. They're a little simpler than that, and they only require kind of the fundamentals of design to be right. Now, the interesting thing is your house may be wider than the new house is allowed to be, because many of those ranches were originally very wide on their lot. And now the new home that's going in, right, it may have a limit on its width. So even though it's going up, it's going to be more limited in its width likely. So
That's only on
hopefully,
small lots. You're limited on width. If you're a big lot, like 2 acres, you can have a wide house.
that's correct. So we'll be happy to hang around a few minutes and answer any more questions, but we appreciate your coming tonight, and we hope you'll be there supporting the code in front of at least the planning board, if not the council eventually.
When would that be?
In planning board in April, May?
I think April for planning board, hoping either May or June for council.
What night?
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you very
What
much.
April?